The name Dracula sends shivers down our spines. It conjures images of a dark, brooding figure cloaked in mystery and menace, lurking in the shadows of a Gothic castle. This iconic character has become synonymous with the very essence of horror, a symbol of the unknown and the supernatural. But what is it about Dracula that has cemented his place in our collective consciousness for over a century? A whisper in the dark, a fleeting shadow. These are the hallmarks of Dracula's presence, the subtle yet unmistakable signs that he is near. His ability to instill fear with just a whisper or a shadow is a testament to the power of his legend, a promise of something both alluring and terrifying. Dracula embodies the duality of attraction and repulsion, a creature who is both seductive and deadly. His charm is irresistible, yet his intentions are malevolent. This paradox is at the heart of his enduring appeal, a character who can draw us in even as he repels us. For over a century this figure has haunted our imaginations, crossing from page to screen, from whispered legend to global icon. From Bram Stoker's original novel to countless film adaptations, Dracula has been reimagined and reinvented, each iteration adding new layers to his mythos. But what is it about Dracula that continues to fascinate us? Is it his immortality, the idea of a being who can transcend time and death? Or is it his connection to the darker aspects of human nature, the parts of ourselves that we fear and yet are drawn to explore? Is it the seductive power of the vampire, a creature of the night who offers immortality at a price? The vampire's bite is both a curse and a gift, a transformation that promises eternal life, but at the cost of one's humanity. This Faustian bargain is a central theme in the Dracula story, a reflection of our own struggles with temptation and desire. Or is it the chilling history that underpins the myth, the story of a real-life prince whose cruelty earned him the title Vlad the Impaler? Vlad III, a ruler of Wallachia in the 15th century, was known for his brutal methods of punishment, impaling his enemies on stakes and leaving their bodies as a warning to others. His reign of terror became the foundation for the Dracula legend, a real-life horror that was transformed into a supernatural one. Dracula, it seems, exists in that strange and potent space where fiction and reality blur. He is a character who is both historical and mythical, a figure who can be traced back to a real person, but who has also taken on a life of his own in the realm of fiction. This blending of fact and fantasy is part of what makes Dracula so compelling, a character who can be endlessly reinterpreted and reimagined. He is a monster for our times and all time. Dracula's story has been adapted to fit different eras and cultural contexts, each version reflecting the fears and anxieties of its time. From the Victorian Gothic to modern horror, Dracula remains a relevant and resonant figure, a symbol of the darkness that lies at the edge of human experience. His story, ever evolving, reflects our deepest fears and our enduring fascination with the darkness that lies at the edge of human experience. Dracula is a mirror, reflecting our own fears and desires, our fascination with the unknown and the supernatural. He is a character who can be both a villain and a victim, a monster and a tragic figure. Join me now as we journey into the world of Dracula, exploring his cinematic afterlife and the historical figure who inspired this enduring legend. We will delve into the shadows, tracing his evolution from Bram Stoker's Victorian Gothic novel to the iconic monster of our screens. We will delve into the shadows, tracing his evolution from Bram Stoker's Victorian Gothic novel to the iconic monster of our screens. We will explore the many faces of Dracula, from the suave and sophisticated vampire of the silver screen to the monstrous and terrifying figure of folklore. And we will uncover the truth behind the myth, the story of Vlad III, a man whose life was as shrouded in darkness as the vampire he inspired. We will examine the historical context of his reign, the political and social factors that shaped his actions, and the ways in which his story was transformed into the legend of Dracula. Join me as we unravel the enduring shadow of Dracula, a figure who continues to captivate and terrify us to this day. The story of Dracula's cinematic reign begins in the silent era. Just a few decades after Bram Stoker's novel, filmmakers saw the potential for horror in this tale of a Transylvanian count. The first adaptation, however, was shrouded in its own darkness. In 1922, F.W. Murnau unleashed an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula. Unable to secure rights to the book, Murnau made changes to names and details, but the essence remained, a haunting tale of a shadowy creature preying on the innocent. Max Schreck's performance as Count Orlok was unforgettable. His gaunt features, his talon-like fingers, his movements, at once stiff and predatory, created a monster that was truly unsettling. Set the stage for how Dracula would be seen on screen, a creature of the night, gaunt and menacing. While the 1922 silent film Nosferatu established a visual language for Dracula, with its eerie and grotesque portrayal of Count Orlok, it was Bela Lugosi who truly defined the archetype of the modern vampire. Lugosi's portrayal brought a new dimension to the character, blending sophistication with an underlying menace. In 1931, Universal Pictures released Dracula, a talking picture that would cement Lugosi's place in cinematic history. This film was a landmark in horror cinema, not just for its technical achievements but for its unforgettable central performance. Lugosi, already famous for playing Dracula on stage, brought a hypnotic charisma to the role that was impossible to ignore. His stage experience allowed him to infuse the character with a theatricality that translated beautifully to the screen. His Dracula was elegant, seductive, and dangerous, a combination that had never been seen before in such a compelling way. Lugosi's performance was a masterclass in controlled menace, where every gesture and glance was loaded with meaning. His accent, thick with the suggestion of far-off lands, his piercing gaze, and his formal, almost courtly manner, all contributed to the image of the vampire as a figure of both repulsion and attraction. Lugosi's Dracula was not just a monster, he was a dark, romantic figure, embodying the allure of the forbidden. This duality made the character endlessly fascinating and set the standard for future portrayals. The film was a massive success, establishing the vampire as a mainstay of horror cinema and making Lugosi a household name. Audiences were captivated by his performance, and the film's success paved the way for a slew of vampire movies that followed. Lugosi's performance, with its blend of menace and allure, became the blueprint for countless Dracula portrayals to come. His ability to convey both the charm and the danger of the character made his Dracula the definitive version for many. His image, the slicked-back hair, the cape, the hypnotic stare, became synonymous with the character, instantly recognizable and endlessly imitated. Even today, nearly a century later, Lugosi's Dracula remains the gold standard, a testament to his enduring impact on the genre. The 1950s and 60s saw the rise of Hammer Horror, a British studio that breathed new life into classic monster movies. This era marked a significant shift in the horror genre, moving away from the more subdued and atmospheric films of the 1930s and 40s and embracing a bolder, more visceral approach. Hammer Horror's films were characterized by their vivid color, graphic violence, and overt sexuality, which set them apart from their predecessors and made them a sensation among audiences. The studio's success was built on its ability to reimagine and revitalize classic horror icons, and no actor was more synonymous with this era than Christopher Lee. Lee's portrayal of Dracula became the defining role of his career, and his interpretation of the character left an indelible mark on the genre. Christopher Lee brought a new intensity to the role of Dracula, one that was both terrifying and magnetic. His tall, imposing figure and deep, resonant voice made him a commanding presence on screen. Lee's Dracula was not just a villain, he was a force of nature, a predator who exuded both charm and menace. In a series of films that redefined the character for a new generation, Lee's Dracula was a stark contrast to Bela Lugosi's earlier portrayal. Lugosi's Dracula, with his refined manners and hypnotic gaze, was a creature of elegance and mystery. In contrast, Lee's Dracula was more physically imposing, more overtly powerful and predatory. Lee's Dracula was, in many ways, a departure from Lugosi's interpretation. Where Lugosi was refined and hypnotic, Lee was more physically imposing, more overtly powerful and predatory. His Dracula was less a figure of seduction and more a monster of raw, animalistic desire. Lugosi's Dracula had an air of sophistication, a certain old-world charm that made him both alluring and dangerous. He was a master of seduction, using his hypnotic powers to bend his victims to his will. Lee, on the other hand, brought a primal energy to the role. His Dracula was a creature driven by base instincts, a predator who reveled in the hunt. Lee's physicality was a key element of his performance. He towered over his co-stars, his presence alone enough to instill fear. His Dracula was not just a manipulator, he was a warrior, a being of immense strength and ferocity. This was a Dracula who could overpower his victims with sheer force, a stark contrast to Lugosi's more cerebral approach. More overtly powerful and predatory, Lee's Dracula was a figure of raw, animalistic desire. His fangs were not just for show, they were weapons, tools of a predator who took what he wanted without hesitation. This was a Dracula who embraced his monstrous nature, who reveled in the fear he inspired. His Dracula was less a figure of seduction, and more a monster of raw, animalistic desire. Hammer's Dracula films were also notable for their more explicit depictions of violence and sexuality. These were not the gothic romances of the Universal era. These were films that reveled in the visceral thrill of the vampire myth. Hammer's Dracula films were also notable for their more explicit depictions of violence and sexuality. The studio did not shy away from showing the blood and brutality of the vampire's attacks, nor did it hold back on the sensuality that was always an undercurrent in the Dracula story. These films pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in mainstream cinema at the time, and in doing so they created a new template for horror. These were not the gothic romances of the Universal era, these were films that reveled in the visceral thrill of the vampire myth. The Universal Dracula, with its shadowy sets and atmospheric tension, was a product of its time, a reflection of the fears and anxieties of the 1930s. Hammer's Dracula, on the other hand, was a creature of the modern age, a reflection of a society that was becoming more open about its desires and fears. These were films that reveled in the visceral thrill of the vampire myth. Lee's Dracula was a creature of the night, yes, but he was also a creature of the flesh, driven by primal urges. His hunger was not just for blood but for power, for dominance, for the thrill of the hunt. This was a Dracula who was both terrifying and fascinating, a monster who was all too human in his desires. Lee's Dracula was a creature of the night, yes, but he was also a creature of the flesh, driven by primal urges. His portrayal brought a new dimension to the character, one that was both terrifying and compelling. This was a Dracula who was not just a monster but a reflection of the darker aspects of human nature. But he was also a creature of the flesh, driven by primal urges. In the hands of Christopher Lee and Hammer horror, Dracula became more than just a figure of fear. He became a symbol of the untamed, the forbidden, the primal forces that lie beneath the surface of civilized society. This was a Dracula for a new age, a monster who was both timeless and utterly contemporary.